Alright, hello, my name is Kate Hallin, and welcome to my senior TED Talk. Why do the better angels of our nature exist? Why do we do what we do? In this research, I aimed to find out why by asking, why and how do genetics affect degrees of altruism in humans? But I looked at this through the frame of evolution and empathetic behavior. First, a bit of clarification. In order to determine what I'm studying, I have to first define what pro-social behavior is. Now, in humans, I would be studying the inclination towards such as a trait, but pro-social behavior unto itself is essentially an individual sacrificing resources for the benefit of another individual. Alright, so in order to properly understand this theory, it gets a little more complicated. I have to go back to the very beginnings of life. Now, some of the most widely accepted theories of this are that all life essentially began in a primordial soup. All life was a matter of proteins. And in this sense, all proteins, naturally, want to remain stable. In doing so, a lot of them need to gain and accumulate other proteins in order to do so. The proteins in this primordial soup, which were most able to do this, were those that became the most populous. Now, furthermore, if a protein were able to replicate itself, it would further outnumber those that were not able to do so. And so essentially, the two main functions of primordial RNA became to survive and then to reproduce. Now, from there, we can go to DNA. And essentially, we can talk about how RNA becomes more complicated in order to fulfill these goals. All living things are essentially machines developed by this DNA, albeit unconsciously, in order to achieve both these goals, survival and reproduction. In essence, genetic stability and immortality. Alright, so, secondly, it must be established that like all... I'm glad I put that one on there. Alright, like all physical adaptations, mental adaptations are also variable. This can be proven by a study conducted by Simpson and Willer in 2008's first edition of Social Psychology Quarterly. In this study, they took a population of random participants and judged them based on their tendency not only towards altruistic behavior, but their reasonings for said altruistic behavior. As it turns out, people not only vary in how they are inclined to social behavior, but they also vary in why they are inclined to social behavior. Now, for example, someone who is inclined to social behavior and would be considered a pure altruist would be someone who does it simply out of the goodness of their heart, or more realistically, the emotions which motivate them to do so. Now, somebody who would be considered more of an egoist would be someone who would do pro-social actions in order to demonstrate to others that they are pro-social and thus establish them as better trading partners. But I'll get into that later. So anyways, once we've established this, it is true that like physical adaptations, mental adaptations, and specifically inclinations towards altruism can be selected by evolution. Alright. So why have they been selected in humans? The first set of these theories, which explains it, can be condensed into one principle, that of individual to individual relations. Now, in this sense, it is simply one individual interacting with another in an altruistic format, or lack thereof. In this format, we have two main theories, the first one being inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness is defined as an individual wanting to preserve those closest to it in its genetic makeup. So this explains why people are closely connected to siblings, and for example, why mothers are so protective of their children, because they contain a large percentage of those genes. Now, secondly, we have reciprocal altruism theory, in which two individuals who are interacting with each other, individual A and individual B, separate from this, give each other resources in the hopes that they will be paid back someday. For example, if individual A provides individual B with resources in the now, he or she might be paid back later with the same or even greater quantity in the future so as to be able to maintain resource homeostasis and thus propagate their genes. Now, this can be a variation in the prisoner's dilemma. Essentially, use a laser. What we have here is prisoner A and prisoner B. Now, supposedly, both of these prisoners have co-committed a crime, and they are being questioned by the authorities, whoever they may be. Each prisoner has two choices. They can stay silent about their actions, or they can confess tell the police what their partner did, and betray their partner. Now, if they confess and betray, but the other partner does not, they walk free, whereas their partner serves the maximum sentence. However, if both confess and betray, each serves 3 times what they would have to serve if they both stayed silent. Now, essentially, the rewards of speaking up might look like the best option. However, in this case, serving 1 month in jail as opposed to serving 1 full year in jail via cooperation demonstrates much less risk, and in the long-term scale of evolution, it's theoretically much more viable. Alright, so the second section of theories relating to the evolution of social creatures' pro-social motivations is that of individual versus group interaction. The first of these is called Indirect Reciprocity, in which an individual within a group can demonstrate to all the other members of that group how altruistic they are and how good of a trading partner they are by demonstrating altruistic actions. Now, this may be manipulative, as we explained in the before studies, or it could also be based on emotion. In that same sense, the individual might benefit from the group because of loyalty. This is why we tend to have groupishness in humans, because when that loyalty is demonstrated, the individual who demonstrates it is widely benefited. Alright, secondly, we have group versus group selection. Now, in evolutionary psychology, as humans are social creatures, there has been a theory proposed that groups of humans can be selected against other groups of humans. Now, logically, a group that would be able to cooperate effectively, and thus accumulate resources, would be better off than a group that is unable to do so. And therefore, the genes there in that cooperative group would tend to be selected over the genes in the non-cooperative group, therefore becoming more numerous. Finally, we have the gene culture evolution theory. Now, this takes it a little bit more modern. In the Pleistocene era, approximately when human culture first became apparent, was when something called social and cultural learning would have become important as well. An individual in a social group, interacting with other creatures in that group, would find it very beneficial to demonstrate pro-social behavior in regard to cultural norms. Because when these norms are demonstrated correctly, that sense of loyalty that I talked about in the first example is also demonstrated correctly. Now, for the final proof of why this was positively selected in humans. In a case study done on kindergartners, it was found that kindergartners with callous unemotional traits, or those limiting their ability to display pro-social behavior, were those lacking in peer support. Now, this has a lot of consequences for a social creature in a primordial environment. For example, a human on the savannah without peer support would essentially be condemned to death. Fair, right? Yeah. So pretty much a child, or an adult even, without these pro-social motivating behaviors, would not be able to survive and reproduce with the same success as his peers, which were able to do so. Therefore, the theory goes that altruism and altruistic behavior, as well as inclinations to such, would have been selected in humans. Now, however, there are some issues with this reasoning, which I will come clean about. In evolutionary psychology, the whole field is essentially theory, and it becomes rather difficult to study what you can't study because you don't have a time machine. So you can't necessarily go back to a tribe of humans and ask them questions about how they feel. It's only theory and modern studies combined which can come to these conclusions, and therefore when I say conclusions, I mean most likely conclusions. Alright. Okay. So, what can be concluded from this? Essentially, what can be concluded, and in order to answer my first question, we can state, based on research, it can likely be stated that human inclinations to altruistic behavior are based on selfish genes' drive to immortality. Now, in application to actual society, what does this mean? Now, in human society, it has long been considered an almost divine principle to feel pro-social emotions and to exhibit pro-social behavior. However, when we reduce this to a more simplistic base, as well as that connecting us more to nature, it becomes a little less glamorous, unfortunately. And in that same sense, although we may still value them, it can still be deduced that our compassions, our loves, and our loyalties are all the manipulations of selfish proteins. Thank you.